So it's 6 p.m. sharp, so let me slowly start our today's seminar. So good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening to talk about the knowledge production about and with Ukraine that we are going to discuss with our distinguished guests. So I'm very happy that this topic sparked some interest among scholars and among practitioners. And we've been discussing this with Natalia Otrishchenko for some time already, and we had this thought that it might be an interesting topic to make it public and to organize seminar dedicated to the knowledge production. And we are going to talk today about how things can go wrong when it comes to knowledge production. What are the risks we are running, and also what can we do about this? So also what can be the good practice regarding the knowledge production about the current conflict in Ukraine. And first, let me briefly introduce our speakers today in an alphabetical order. So our first speaker today will be Felix Ackermann, who is a historian and anthropologist trained in cultural studies at European University Viadrina and in political sciences at London School of Economics. And since September 2020, Felix is a professor for public history at Friend Universität in Hagen. The next speaker is Natalia Otrishchenko, who is a research fellow at the Center for Urban History in Lviv. And since 2022, Natalia leads the Ukrainian team within the international initiative 24th of February 2022, 5 a.m. Testimonies from the War. And in 2022, she was a Fulbright visiting scholar at Columbia University, and currently she is based in Potsdam as a visiting scholar, and as I mentioned before, I also was one of the initiators of this discussion. Our next speaker today is Wanner, and she's a professor of history and cultural anthropology at the Pennsylvania State University. In 2019 and 2020, she was a Fulbright scholar at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And in 2020, she was awarded a Distinguished Scholar Prize from the Association for the Study of Eastern Christianity. And last but not least, of course, is Andrei Vazyanau, who is a lecturer at European Humanities University in Vilnius, and his background includes studies on urban life, mobility, and activism in Ukraine, Romania, and Belarus. So once again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for agreeing to discuss today. And now I pass the virtual, of course, mic to Natalia, just for some introductory words before we start.
Yeah, thank you, Małgorzata, and thank you all for coming, for joining us from different continents and different time zones into this virtual space to discuss the issues which all of us think are quite relevant, not only to the case of Ukraine, but generally about the way how we produce knowledge in social sciences and what is the impact of the knowledge that we give to the world. And other projects, the Testimonies from the War, started from the extraordinary numerous acts of solidarity that happened between the Center for Urban History and our team and our partners and colleagues from all over Europe and now from the world. And this solidarity happened on a very different levels, simply by providing us with intellectual help and support, and inviting us to homes and parts of people who really wanted to help somehow. And also some institutional support, finding funding for Ukrainian scholars who had to be displaced either within Ukraine or outside of Ukraine. So this solidarity happened because there were the networks based on which we can cooperate. And throughout the year, since the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine, we see hubs of networks are expanding. And we also see this solidarity because we acknowledge the global impact of Russian war in Ukraine, how it shaped academia, not only in our part of the world, but globally. So our big questions to ourselves and to you, what can we learn from this specific experience of this project? What practices could be scaled and institutionalized? Because the time of emergency opens certain possibilities, which with time close. So should we scale up something? Should we institutionalize something? And what are the problems? What were the pitfalls that we've seen on the way? It is something that we are going to talk with you today. And we are really looking forward to your questions and your contributions, because we don't want it to be speaking only from our side. And if you have anything to share, we really would be happy to hear your impact as well.
So thank you very much, Natalia, for this. And regarding questions and discussions, so after our discussion here, you are of course welcome to ask any questions, and you can do it in two ways. So on the one hand, you can post your questions and comments and use the chat in Zoom, or later you can raise your hand and ask the question directly. Unmute and ask the question. So let's start then. My first question is maybe a little obvious, but I think sometimes it's never enough to stress it. So the full-scale conflict war, the full-scale war that started in February last year, changed lives of many people, many social groups in Ukraine, and of course scholars as well. So first, I would like to ask Natalia and Andrei. So how does this war influence scholars from Ukraine? What activities were started? What was suspended? What is happening right now in the research field, especially as you're here in the field also of social sciences? Natalia.
Yeah, maybe I will ask Andrei to start because I just spoke, and then I will continue.
Of course.
It's quite difficult to start, specifically because my situation is not very typical. Yeah, so to answer this, I first have to substantiate how I am a researcher from Ukraine, or a researcher of Ukraine. This I'll make a bit later. One first thing that I think is relevant for every person connected to Ukraine also personally is that during the war, you cannot go on with academic activity the way that International Academy expects you to. I think we're all familiar with that usual cycle of production of academic texts. And I see that cycle as deeply problematic in the context of the ongoing war. The speed of this knowledge production and dissemination has to be absolutely different. And the situation when we have articles undergoing second round of peer review, like 2 years after submission, this is something that makes this text not adequate to the situation. And I'm speaking about this also from a Belarusian perspective, because as Małgorzata mentioned, I did research there as well. Arguably, I did more research on Ukraine, but my 2020, the year 2020, I spent there. And I know that still there are some articles that are not published because they are peer-reviewed. Now I'm starting to hear quite similar stories about publications on Ukraine, because 9 months, for instance, or 1 year is is below the average when we are talking about journals and social sciences, especially. As far as I know, it's a little bit faster in political sciences, but for anthropologists and sociologists and maybe historians, correct me if I'm wrong, yeah, that can really last for 1 year or two. And yeah, the second thing that I wanted to mention is the importance of our personal engagements with Ukraine, because we are coming from different parts of the country and we also have different documents for now. And not every person who has lived in Ukraine for many years, who has spent their childhood there and wrote their dissertations about Ukraine and had entire family in Ukraine at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, has Ukrainian passport. I have Belarusian one and Ukrainian residence permit. And this puts me, for instance, in a very specific position of a person who is able to come, but also able to go, which is not accessible for male researchers from Ukraine. And this is what we can observe also visually on international conferences dedicated to Ukraine. People from researchers from Ukraine, they had a dilemma of either staying in Ukraine if they were in Ukraine as of February 24 last year, or basically many of them were also outside the country. And then for them, it was a dilemma whether they go to their field, because Ukraine is our field physically, yeah, or they go on with remote ethnography and then preserve the possibility to be present at international events. So that bureaucratic dimension, I think, is also quite important. It's quite underestimated. And I'm paying attention to this also because in the year 2022, there was a Congress of researchers of Belarus, to which hardly any Belarusian could come from Belarus because they needed visas and the visas are not issued. And it actually took part without people who live and do their research in Belarus. And due to security concerns, we mostly could not do it in online format. So definitely it also affects the way that the knowledge is produced. And we see today in both cases how the earliest publications that appear, they're written by Western researchers, not by those who lived in Ukraine or by those who were in Ukraine as of the beginning of the war during last year. So these are my very subjective observations, probably.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia.
I can continue on some of the topics that Andrei just posed. But I will start first with our deep embeddedness in our bodies, which is usually invisible in academia, which perceives us as transparent beings, non-related to other texts. But what we actually experienced with the direct threats to our lives and lives of our loved ones, that we are not transparent. We are really embedded in multiple connections in our life situation. And our bodies matter. Our bodies which are deprived of food, of sleep, which are constantly anxious and tired. It is not the body that produces academic knowledge, because it's definitely not the first time priority to think about, different temporality. Because academia, as Andrei mentioned, operates on different temporality than a very speeded up time of the war, where every moment can change everything drastically. So first, this understanding of how our life situations are, inseparate from our writing, and how the ideal of academic detachment is not working here, that you cannot simply separate yourself from the war situation. And therefore, usually you could be claimed and labeled as subjective, as too emotional, as the one who is not actually academic enough to participate in the discussion. But when you have bombs falling on your head, and when you are constantly unsure about your life and life of all meaningful ones, it's really, really difficult to maintain this neutrality. And one of the big lessons that I learned personally, that neutrality is an act of privilege. And you could basically being neutral is not being neutral. It's usually meaning supporting the status quo and supporting those in power. And bringing values into our writing and bringing up that we had during the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And also thinking about ourselves as multi-layered beings. We have multiple roles. We are not only scholars, we are also children to our elderly parents. We are also parents to our kids. We are also spouse and loved ones by someone. We have our friends, we have our communities. And these multiple connections are extremely meaningful for us. And therefore the choices that we made since the full-scale invasion were partially influenced by these positions that we have, by these responsibilities that we put on ourselves. Also the resources that we have, the life circumstances, and also some legal restraints, as also Andrei mentioned. For male researchers in Ukraine, it is impossible to leave the country now. Therefore, we have a certain demographics of people who are scholars and at risk from Ukraine, who are mainly female scholars. But also, if you think about these demographics, these female scholars with children who have this multiple pressures, not only to produce academic knowledge, but also to sustain their families, to take care of their kids, to stay connected with their loved ones who are remain in Ukraine, who could be drafted or who are in army. So it also puts a certain pressure and influences the way how we engage in this international academic communication. So we have these different roles and different trajectories depending on this multiple issues that I just mentioned. For male and for female scholars, they will differ drastically because of the legal constraints, but also how our civil identity and how one of the first reactions for almost everyone whom I know was very direct volunteering and helping people with their basic needs. We were not engaging in writing articles, first of all. We started with providing food and shelter for those who need it. So it also shows you how you are embedded and how you are separate from different communities which are important for you. And the moment when you can step back into academic work is also an act of privilege. It means that all of your basic needs are satisfied. It also means that you have electricity and water and more or less stable internet connection, which is also now part of the critical infrastructure and helps Ukrainians to communicate with the outside world and participate in this type of exchange. So it means that you need to have these infrastructures, which are usually not questioned by academics in the world, which is a good thing, that we take these things for granted. But we need stable institutions and we need stable infrastructures in order to engage in scientific writing and scientific communication. It's another big lesson from the last year. And probably the final thing that I will mention here, and I will stop, is understanding academia as a cumulative activity. And in order to understand where we are, we need to see where we were and what was the past of Ukrainian scholars and what were the inequalities to start with, which were not started on February 21st, 2022. We have to think in a longer perspective on the way how academic work in Ukraine was underfinanced have access to the literature was quite limited, and how we had really very different starting positions, and how even those things that were collected by Ukrainian scholars could perish in the fire because so many institutions were destroyed. And one of the first things that also people did, just secured the thing that they had. Just preserve what you already did is also a very important step that you have to make in order to start from somewhere. And I can recall some of the stories that I heard from people who left their libraries. The books that they've collected for all of their life, they have to leave them back home, and some of them never returned. So it's also a big issue to think on what we are building ourselves and our professional careers. And for Ukrainians, it's definitely a very different starting point than from our Western colleagues.
Thank you very much, Andrei and Natalia, for this really big reminder that being the researcher of Ukraine from Ukraine can be such a huge difference and such a huge, what a different positionality it is. Now, if I may move to Catherine and Felix, regarding this scholarly activity of researchers from Ukraine, and as well, just to follow this notion that I borrowed from Andrei of Ukraine and from Ukraine. So, what are your observations in this field? What is happening right now from your observation? If there are any, let's say, priority areas that emerged and or which need to be prioritized. So, Catherine. You need to unmute yourself, I think.
There we go. Sorry. First, thank you for the invitation to be here. I think this is a really important topic, and I'm glad we are addressing it. Andrei and Natalia have spoken about the enormous constraints that have been foisted upon Ukrainian researchers. There are other kinds of constraints on Westerners. They're incomparable in many ways, but the problem is constraints inevitably make it harder to both produce and share research. So what I wanted to speak about is some of the challenges that people outside of Ukraine face when it comes to understanding and analyzing what's happening in Ukraine, and then the challenges we face in terms of sharing that research and what might be some solutions. The first issue is that there's very few funding agencies that will fund any kind of research in Ukraine. In other words, they won't financially support that. So this, of course, is this is huge when it comes to researchers and graduate students and even undergraduate students who would like to study abroad. Right away, not doing anything is not an option in my view, because if ever there was a moment when there's a need, a pressing need for research and research on Ukraine of all kinds. And I would even go so far as to say, even really throughout a recasting of the way we do research on the whole region, that moment is now. So I think we need to seize that moment, but we are seizing it faced with extraordinary constraints that make it difficult, as Andrei and Natalia said, for Ukrainians to work at home. And we are facing it at a moment when it makes others, such as myself, I've conducted ethnographic and archival research in Ukraine for over 30 years now. And I think it could be that 2022 will probably be the first year in many, many years that I did not travel to Ukraine. And so these are significant constraints. However, if there is a silver lining to COVID, I think it has allowed for meetings such as this one and other ways of cooperating in terms of both producing and sharing our research. I'll just mention a few things that I have come up with. They're not perfect, and obviously these kinds of Zoom meetings, I think, don't take the place of meeting in person, but they're certainly better than nothing. And as I mentioned, nothing is not an option for me. So for example, in terms of my own research, I'm trying more closely to collaborate, both in terms of writing and research with my Ukrainian colleagues. And here I think this potentially across the board could be a good thing, because we're bringing together more in-depth local knowledge, especially when one speaks about what's currently happening in Ukraine, with other scholars who perhaps can translate certain cultural concepts, certain understandings, and perhaps add a comparative dimension so as to make Ukraine known to a wider audience. I think we have a moment here when there's lots of interest in the region, especially in Ukraine, but in the region, and there's a certain openness to rethinking many of the assumptions and even stereotypes and ideologically created understandings or biases that we had. And it's really important to take advantage of this moment of openness and interest. And I think perhaps through cooperative, collaborative research is one way of doing it. So for example, I am editing a volume on dispossession. And there are, I'd say probably 2/3 of the contributors are from Ukraine. And we have other contributors from around the world, but we are workshopping each of the chapters. Natalia is contributing a chapter. And so then when someone writes about Crimea, you then have someone who's from Crimea commenting on it before anything ever goes to press. You have someone who, language politics, for example, in Ukraine, then receives the feedback from someone who's a native Ukrainian or Russian native speaker. This kind of, I think, collaborative endeavors that invite exchange of ideas, I think can help to deepen the end result of our research by combining both the insight of somebody who is from the region with somebody who is knowledgeable about the region, but not from the region. So in other words, you get both the insider and outsider perspective. Another thing that I've tried to do, given the various constraints about mobility that especially Andrei brought up, is to organize what I called a teach-in on this war and bringing together Ukrainians wherever they might be. Almost all of them were in Ukraine, but by calling it a teach-in, we're then reaching out and making a space for the next generation of up-and-coming scholars. So then my hope was to interest people in Ukraine in particular, and in why this war has broken out and why Ukraine matters, to bring that, to make that clear to the next generation so that they will begin to think about Ukraine and situating their research in the region in a far more broader way. I think those kinds of collaborative endeavors to both produce knowledge inevitably help in the process of sharing knowledge. And I see this event as one such way to also shape both the production of knowledge and the sharing of it. So thank you once again for the invitation to participate.
Thank you very much. And Felix.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I I wanted to start with this strange memory of late February when I after spending 7 years in Warsaw, I took a train to West Germany in order to sign the first permanent contract in my academic career. And on the same train, actually, were the first refugees who decided already on the 24th of February to leave Kharkiv and Odessa. And I had this strange year when I moved myself with my family from Warsaw to Berlin, and at the same time so many colleagues from Ukraine but also from Belarus had to change their places, and I came to understand the high level of privilege I had. Just to give an example, the library, I carried my whole library for 10 years to Vilnius and then to Warsaw, and there was a company paid by my institute to carry like dozens of boxes with these books, and of course this is a very specific mode of academic nomadism compared to actual refugees and the necessity to escape, and particularly when it comes to the question how things will develop next year, what comes after the first programs come to an end, which supports Ukrainian scholars in an emergency way of doing business. And for me, from my own perspective, it was important, as Andrei mentioned, that 2020, the protests and then the following waves of repressions in Belarus against Belarusian citizens by their own state, they were something like a test for institutions in Poland and in Germany. And I found in this, like I had this very strong experience that it is important after half a year and after a year to think of how to make this transition from an emergency state of where it is actually really important to find shelter, to not to think of research agendas and of to-dos in academic terms, like how to proceed to actually come back to ask questions and to make like to allow yourself and your colleagues to think about what is important or what would be important to be to carry out research on. And of course, in like I will now speak about Germany because I spent already half a year in this new system. As Catherine mentioned, it is the same for Germany, that actually we have no established procedures for what comes after half a year, what comes after a year, because actually there was a lot of solidarity provided by foundations, by universities, but it was all linked to the notion of temporality, that it will come to an end. And I think we already reached this point when most of these emergency scholarships are not renewed by the same institutions. So it turned out that for those Ukrainian scholars, for those few Ukrainian scholars, I managed to take some responsibility for that. It is really the core of our joint work that to think about, on the one hand, research which makes sense and which is possible being based in Germany, often without knowing German language, having limited access to Ukrainian sources, and then at the same time thinking about research funding in this very German frame. And I have to say that the German frame is very strict, not only to Ukraine in regard to Ukrainians and Belarusians, but also to Germans. And yes, so this is one thing I wanted to share. And the other thing, of course, the other observation, of course, is about speed. I mean, as all of you have noticed in other regards, then Germany is really slow in reacting to changes occurred on a very large scale. But I think that you could say the same for academia. On the one hand, you saw a lot of really of actual solidarity provided by colleagues for colleagues. but the more structural issues, I think we haven't even addressed very much. So I'm speaking here really about rethinking the way how we have carried out Eastern European studies as basically Russian and Soviet studies. The problematic, like the high degree, like the high extent to which we were focused on archives, resources, and questions centered at Moscow in various centuries, not only for the 20th century. The language question, so you would have basically a lot of chairs for Eastern European history, but most of these environments are Russophone in Germany, so this is a big issue for, in practical terms, how to change this. And so I can see here really a very slow way of coming to terms. And just one example which I found like really so the only response of German academia to 2014 was the creation of this chair for Ukrainian history as entangled history in Frankfurt Oder. And as a matter of fact, it was not the first time that it was only provided with half of the funding. So Andrei Portnov started basically with 50% salary, and as a matter of fact, after 2022, he is still a 50% professor. And for me, this is like a deep sign of anti-Slavonic sentiments, like deeply embedded in German academia. And just one example that we have not yet changed very much, or even started to address these issues.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I think what the issue that emerges here from every speaker that we have a pleasure to hear is that there is a notion of certain different sensitivities, different not only expectations, but the way we approach certain topics, the roles that we fulfill. So my question to all of you is there really such a thing that you noticed? And if yes, what is it about when we are thinking of researchers from Ukraine approaching the topic of the current war, and researchers from the broadly understood West when they proceed with writing about it? So how do you perceive it, Andrei?
Well, as the colleagues and especially Felix mentioned, we are now in a situation when basically the academic view into Eastern Europe is undergoing some transformations. And I also think that this is very large potential lies in focusing on same objects for longer time could lead us into development of some new theories. And some of those theories were quite fascinating. I mean, I was enjoying reading about Europeanization and relocation of Europe with the use of different concepts. But when we look at the context, such as Ukraine as well, sometimes we face the things that do not seem historically new. We're all the time talking about historical repetition. So those things might be, those ongoing events might be outstanding, but not interesting because they had already happened in the history. So I see the particular vulnerability in like recurrent historical comparisons, that on one side, I think that we should be sincere about the unprecedented character of what is going on. And I think that sometimes might be even frightening. scary to us, but that also might help us avoid some generalizations and theoretizations. And the second thing here is about the privilege of theoretization, because the research on Ukraine now evolves from everyday concerns. I mean, I'm referring to the everyday of the war. We quite often are dealing with documentation more than with analysis, which is also not the most attractive thing to many researchers from who can distantiate themselves. Yeah. So here there is a special challenge that I see, that we cannot sometimes produce knowledge that is conceptually elegant and attractive enough, because we don't have that privilege of elegant conceptualization. So this is the thing I wanted to mention, but to give also an opposite side of it, as we heard on the workshop Witnessing the Now in Warsaw a month ago, the ongoing events are probably the most documented war events in the history, which means that in the future, many opportunities also wait for historians. So this might be promising as well. And as anthropologist, I'm also I feel lost quite often, because my discipline is supposed to deal with the present and less with the past, and even less with the future. No, less like visions and expectations from the future can be studied as well. Yes, I think that's all for this question.
Thank you very much. I think it was really interesting how you mentioned that theoretization is such a privilege sometimes, when you can elegantly wrap up your findings and try to publish a paper without this theoretical background. That is very often a challenge in terms of if we talk about the knowledge production. Yeah, so thank you very much, Natalia.
Yeah, I can briefly add to this theoretization notion, because in order to theorize, you need to engage in the broader conversation. You need to know whom to quote and therefore access the field. And it is something that I mentioned from the very beginning. It was quite a limited access to all the databases of journals and recent publication that not so many Ukrainian scholars can engage into reading and therefore quoting and therefore participating in this discussion. So started from these very different points and very different resources that scholars in Ukraine do have, not only have capacities intellectual to produce elegant theory because you are super concerned with your basic survival and anxious about the nearest future, but also have to connect your finding to a broader field and broader picture. You need to see this picture, you need to access it. So also one of the very practical calls could be like the way how we can, not only in case of Ukraine, but overall think about this distribution of knowledge and journals and publications. How can we make it more equal and more accessible to scholars from the regions where the libraries cannot subscribe for big journals and big publishers and see the field how it is in Western academia. So it's just a brief note to this question of theory production. But thinking about different sensitivities, I think, first of all, it's also a very disciplinary notion, and also Andrei briefly mentioned that. So different disciplines have different scales and tools. Some of them could be quite dehumanizing and abstraction itself be quite violent sometimes, and you experience it because it misses the agency of people. And here would be my big point. Because of all of the sources that we now collect in this one of the most documented war ever, we will finally have access to the voices of people who themselves participated in these events. And we can finally tell the story of the war, not from the outside perspective, as it was usually done, speaking about the region, which was studied mainly through the perspective of Moscow or St. Petersburg, or big imperial centers of knowledge productions, which shed the light on the whole region, and therefore we access the region through the lens and through the sources produced in these big centers. But now we finally can speak based on the sources and listen to the voices of people in the region. And for me, it's also not only about Ukraine, definitely, and both Felix, Catherine, and Andrei mentioned that. So we see this war also as a possibility to revisit the whole field, not only Ukrainian studies, but also studies of the region, and how we can make these different connections, not only between Ukraine and Poland and Belarus, but also think more broadly, think about Congo, think about Rwanda, think about South Asia, make this quite unexpected connections through which we can understand something better. And with Ukraine, we can pose the bigger questions which are important for the humanity in general. We can speak about human rights, we can speak about crimes and violation of these human rights, we can speak about genocide and war crimes, we can speak about ecocide, we can speak about climate change, about so many different issues which are so visible because of this war. So I think it's also a big opportunity for us, this openness of the future, and we can use utopia's methods to imagine really radically different possibilities, and therefore try to shape where it is shapeable and change institutions, funding structures, the spaces where we discuss and where we produce the knowledge. And maybe something good can happen out of all of that.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think this really touches upon very important issues, like the agency and how this agency can also reshape the knowledge production. This is, I think, very important. And there is one point that I would like to ask later, but and to take further. But now I see Andrei raising his hand. Would you like to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add, following what Natalia said about opening up our European cases and connected them to presumably non-European. Just recently, I finally got a preprint of an article that is based on my fieldwork in Mariupol. And like the main stage of the fieldwork was in 2011, 2013, and then there was a small edition of 2020, 2021. Yeah, interacting with editors was very interesting because they wanted, for instance, the proofs that I have written consent and that I'm not disclosing personal data of those whom I interviewed. So we edited the text enormously, but then they also were quite determined to ask me to provide more literature on urban assemblages in the introduction, because that was the conceptual part. And when I was looking for that, it seemed nonsense to me, also because Mariupol is my home city and my family was there as at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But looking for the literature, I came across an anthropological work about infrastructural cannibalism in post-industrial Zambia and in Congo, showing how in the ex-miners region, the population is using scrap metal to support their household economies. that was also described in terms of assemblage. Yeah, so I found a parallel in that African context. And I think also the tragedy of, I'll reformulate. I think that the ongoing war also actually brings into focus what has been happening beyond Europe in the world, and also during previous years.
Thank you very much for this comment. And indeed, this is again what I would like to come back in a second to. So what if we involve something beyond Europe, beyond the global West as well? But for a moment, going back to our issues of difference in approaches and sensitivities, so I would like to get back with this question to Catherine and to Felix. How does it look from your perspective? Is there still something that needs to be that you need to maybe learn, that you need to discover, to know more about?
Well, I guess on the heels of what was just said, I was also thinking about how one can present research. This entails a bit of institutional change in the academy, which is not impossible, but it's difficult. But I think this is a moment when one can push for it. And I'll mention a few of the things that I see as having changed up until now and how I would like to continue to see things changed. I think, whether one speaks about any kind of imperial structure, the French, English, what have you, there has always been a propensity to look at the metropole and discount the agency of colonized peoples. So I think for example, Andrei mentioned these articles on Zaire and elsewhere in the world. Of course, I think one needs to think as broadly as possible. And I think comparison is enormously valuable. And so I think this then is in part what brings me back to collaborative research, where one has a greater chance of accurately and doing comparative work well. We know that in a great many disciplines, anthropology, and certainly the humanities, we tend to think of single authored works. I think perhaps we should begin to push back against that. And on the heels of what Andrei said about the time that it takes to get something published, I would notice that certainly in terms of journals, many have developed alternative kinds of formats in which to present research. And I think this is certainly to be encouraged. And in order to encourage that, we need, once again, the academy to recognize that there's value in something beyond a very traditional standard research article. I'm obviously not suggesting abandoning that as a model, but rather to think beyond that. So for example, one of the flagship journals in anthropology is Cultural Anthropology, which by the way now is open access. And that's in response to these kinds of disparities of access. And the last book I published is also open access. So I think there is an attempt to try to make as much work as possible be open access, as well as to be timely. So for example, Cultural Anthropology has an internet-based version of its journal that tries to bring together, it's sort of the anthropology of now, of bring together a variety of voices in a very timely way. So we published the first collection of essays by anthropologists of Ukraine and in Ukraine, and also of Russia altogether, 2 series of. So there are those kinds of internet-based attempts to be open access and to be timely. I'm also thinking about comparative studies in society and history that brings together over time a variety of thematic research articles and trying to use them to comment on contemporary events. In short, there are a variety of ways that people are beginning to change the old model of publishing so that it is far swifter and so that it is far more accessible to a great many more people, because the challenges that Ukrainians faced are not exclusively faced by Ukrainians. They're in essence faced by the entire, what one calls global South. In other words, if you're not in North America or Europe, you have compromised ability to access scholarly materials. So the challenges that Ukrainians are facing are faced by really the majority of people. So all of this has to be addressed. So in other words, issues of access and trying to increase the equality of access, the types of research that is published and the format in which it is published. And I think I go back to more collaborative work. And I just want to, on the notion of collaborative work, I really want to throw into question this idea that somehow Westerners have a privileged way of elegant theoretical formation. I don't think that at all. I think they might have more access to resources, but that doesn't make them smarter by any means. And that doesn't make them more creative thinkers by any means. And I might add, recently, I think some enormously interesting work is coming out of Poland in particular, precisely because of the kinds of sensibilities that Poles have. And Ethnologia Polona right now, it's not necessarily a journal that I have followed in the past, but I think a lot of really innovative work is coming out of that, including an upcoming issue that begins to think about the whole issue of ideological engagement and neutrality. And among the contributions to this journal are one saying that there are many instances in the past when anthropologists have not been neutral at all. For example, during World War II, or for example, in the United States on the issue of racism. And while the details of the invasion today in Ukraine are unprecedented, the specifics of the violation of the sovereignty of a certain country and the magnitude of war crimes, that might be unprecedented. But the issue of abandoning one's neutrality and, as Natalia said, allowing oneself to be emotional and in fact stating up front how one is emotional, how this has influenced one's ideological engagement and one's own commitments, be they moral, be they intellectual, what have you, and how this has affected one's both research process as well as the process of analyzing one's data. I think this is such a moment that has arisen for us now, but I think it's important to note that this is that moment in and of itself is not unprecedented. World War II and the suffering then, and a variety of other events since then, and that's just in the more recent past, I think have also obliged anthropologists and other academics to take a position and to admit and be very forthright about what their commitments are and what their ideological convictions are, and then to note how that has influenced what they study, how they study, and how they have analyzed the material they have collected. So I think by thinking along with other people and by thinking comparatively, the many opportunities that this tragedy does pose can really be expanded beneficially for all of us. I'll leave it there.
I would maybe just briefly add that at the European university where Andrei is teaching now, I spent my time in a very collaborative way, and it was very it was a very productive and fruitful period of my academic work in Lithuania. And like the only way to come back to Germany was actually to leave this behind for actually quite a few years, and to somehow force myself to be an author, just a single author, and to leave this collaborative, at this point it was urban research, behind. And I found my way back to academia in Germany, but as a historian now. And I have this really strange feeling that the way how history is organized in Germany is very much 19th century, and it is still very much, it has still this very deep idea that we do not produce knowledge from a certain perspective, and that there is no non-political way of writing. And the most like intense experience of this was related to this question how to bring together issues like the ongoing events in Central Eastern Europe and global questions. And there was a very intensive debate in Germany actually how to, like how the early genocidal violence in the German colonies are linked to the Second World War and actually the Holocaust, and the way how it was carried out in the killing fields in Eastern Europe. And it is very strange for me that there is a blind spot in this whole German discussion, and it is the blind spot is actually the genocidal violence carried out against Ukrainians, against Belarusians, and also against Russians during World War II and the occupation of Soviet Union. And I tried to bring this into the game, analyzing, like into a discussion by analyzing photo albums from my own family. There are some family members who were part of the Prussian army in Namibia during the Herero, the genocide of the Herero, and also there is a photo album of a great grandparents of my children who was in Warsaw, and there are some Jews on the pictures. And in both photo albums there are quite similar pictures of people who were just hanged. And I made this argument that you could look into this as a specific colonial, the way how these pictures are taken document a specific colonial view, like deeply embedded in German soldiers' photo albums. And it was totally shocking. It was actually my habilitation procedure, so it was a formal procedure, and I was totally shocked by the extent my German colleagues were shocked. They basically commented that this was a very political lecture, and for them this was I was hardly given permission, to proceed. And also they founded this whole idea to include genocidal violence carried out against Slavs into this whole debate about how colonialism and the Holocaust are interlinked. It turned out to be basically too much, and I'm still thinking what to make with this experience, but I think it's linked to the discussion we just had.
So now my final question to you is also somehow like combining the arguments that we have already had, going back to the field of the research field of the Central Eastern Europe, and to what extent this can be an independent research field, in the sense that, as you mentioned, this was very often a very much Russia-oriented field of study, or Russophonic field of study, which is somehow more or less becoming to change. But talking about imperial centers, so do you think there might be somehow a risk that one imperialism is somehow replaced by another one? Talking about Westplaining, talking about frameworks, talking about theories. So do you see this kind of risk for this research field and for the way that knowledge is framed within those research areas? Andrei, can I ask you about this now?
Well, one point here probably would refer to what Catherine told about comparisons and comparative research. I'm very enthusiastic about the idea of writing in collaboration, but I have some precautions about comparative studies, because Russia in studies was not usually compared to anything. It was approached as incomparable and unique. And I see the challenge now in writing about other post-Soviet republics, for instance, about countries of Eastern Partnership in particular. I see the challenge is that formerly we usually consumed the images of each other produced in Moscow. That was a former center of imperialist knowledge production. Now we are trying to reestablish the direct connections, circumventing that center that we aspire to see as the former one. And my experience was that sometimes we need those one author, one country narratives, just because the voices from the country were not really listened to before. And usually it was either an object of comparison with Russia or an object of comparison with each other in relation to Russia. So I don't have an answer here. I am I feel quite lost. Yeah. And also, to give an example, I think among my friends, arguably the same number is drafted to Ukrainian army and imprisoned to Belarusian prison. I think these are about the same number. And I'm socialized, I would say 50-50 for two countries. But can you compare it? No, for many different reasons, and also ethical one, because there would be resistance from both sides, but also because the forms of oppression that the countries are undergoing so different. I was thinking that comparison probably could be done with a country from outside the region, and that would be like less questionable ethically. But I don't know how to secure that it would be also fruitful analytically. And just that what I was thinking about recently, because I was writing about Belarus and Lithuanian, about Ukraine and Belarusian, and about Romania in Ukrainian. And every time working with editors, we had very smooth communication, but I had to explain very, very basic things, like how many million are the population of the neighboring country. Yeah, so it's a very simple test. And I know some numbers that people tell and how they relate to the reality. So that problem of not knowing each other, or knowing each other very, very, to a very limited extent, it persists.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a very important point that we should not think that it's just because always some countries are neighboring to each other, we just know everything and we comment and can compare. This is so important. Thank you, Natalia.
Well, I can build also on one of the comments of Andrei about being very certain about your knowledge on your neighbors. And it's it's a big challenge for us to learn to work with uncertainty and to acknowledge uncertainty as a part of academic writing as well. Because I work in sociology, and I also very related to historical field. And working with history, especially distant history, is for me a bit easier because you have this distance in time, which secures your writing and therefore provides certain linearity to it. So you know the sequence of events, and you can connect some events with another one and saying that it was the cause and it was a result. But if you are in the very open-ended moment, you do not have this privilege to think that something causes something else. You have to work with this uncertainty and never be fully sure that some of your assumption will result into very certain knowledge. You have to question yourself all the time. And I think working with this uncertainty, and it also helps you to be more sensitive, step back from this position from above, which usually is a very tempting one, to think that you as a scholar know things and how society operates and how certain things are interconnected, but rather accept that your knowledge is limited and you have to learn constantly from your peers, from your colleagues, and do not assume that some knowledge that you gain about one country can be easily transferred to quite a different context, which we see as a problem generally in case of Ukraine, when certain presupposed models were just transferred and used as explanatory modes. So this sensitivity and this openness and this uncertainty, I think, help us not to supplement one center of knowledge production with the other one, because it's one of the comments that you might receive, that you just want to supplement Russian studies with Ukrainian studies, but it's not actually the case. You don't want to make one imperial center out of the other. You just want to make sense of the world, and it's easier to have it as the set of interconnection and see war in Ukraine as really point of this interconnection, and how through this war and through this terrible experience of suffering and resilience, we can know something better about human societies, about ourselves, and about the others.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natalia, and for leaving us with this notion that we are actually in this moment, that so many things are open, and how certain research areas will be transformed is also an open-ended issue. Just to remind that the war is still going on, hopefully not for long. Catherine.
Well, one thing that occurred to me as Andrei and Natalia were speaking was maybe it's worth addressing how one produces bad or scholarship, or scholarship that is inadequate. And I think whether one speaks about transferring knowledge from, let's say, knowledge accrued on and in and of Russia, that should perhaps explain Ukraine. Personally, I've never subscribed to that. And I think few people now would, although I think they might have earlier. So I think that kind of transfer of knowledge. So when I speak about comparisons, I mean informed comparisons. I mean, bringing totally disparate things together and pretending they're the same. This is not helpful. But an informed comparison, I think, can help us all see our blind spots. I mean, absolutely everyone has blind spots. And of course, as anthropologists, we know that the same ethnographic research that an American would do on a particular topic is very different than what a Ukrainian would do. Their questions are different. The questions of a man versus a woman, age, and a whole variety of other issues intrude and shape the process of producing knowledge. One so it's important to be aware of one's blind spots. When it comes to Westplaining, that is another form of poor scholarship that we shouldn't emulate. I think that is based on a certain kind of arrogance that suggests that there is this kind of what was referred to earlier as, you know, privileged, exquisite theoretical formation and somehow a superior perspective. And that this then is a license to comment on many things. I think that is not a good recipe for any kind of good scholarship, and someone who does not have the humility to recognize the blind spots that absolutely everyone, including themselves, have, that is to say, the limits of their knowledge, that's a recipe for less than enviable scholarship. So this is where I think acknowledging what one knows, but perhaps also acknowledging what one doesn't know, what one's own positionality offers in a particular analysis, and where perhaps that positionality falls short.
Thank you very much for the comment, and how important it is to also recognize our own situation, our own position, to avoid the poor scholarship simply. Felix.
Well, I mean, I take from this discussion, of course, the notion of collaboration, and I have a very practical task to speed up a little bit with my participation in the Witnessing the Now project, collecting interviews in my part of Germany, Natalia. That's about our collaboration and me speeding up. On the other hand, I have a lot of I should prepare a whole range of distance learning materials as I'm now based in a distance learning university, and there will be a module in about asymmetrical histories and the interaction between Western and Eastern Europe. And my idea for this module was very much something which came up in this discussion, that I would do it in a collaborative way, but also basically leaving colleagues from Ukraine, from Poland, from Belarus, to give them space to also to collaborate between themselves and to come up with, for instance, I'm really looking forward for a new history of Belarus, because in 2020 it turned out that there is an internal Belarusian need for a new way of telling the history of Belarus from below, I would say, and it's not like the Belarusian colleagues who turned out to be without any kind of state support in Belarus. They are capable of doing this, I see myself more providing something like a space and ask them to develop this as part of these teaching materials. And of course, it is an open-ended process because it also can fail for some reasons. And last thing, I'm not so skeptical as Andrei about comparisons, and I like the notion of entanglement, and I don't see a need to make Ukraine now the center of everything. But of course, they're like, just as an example, like I'm thinking about the way how Telegram changes the we all thinking about it, participating in this, like how Telegram changed social communication and the way how publics work in the Russophone and also Ukrainian phone world. And I think that's something you cannot, like, it makes little sense to look only at Ukraine if you think about a short history of Telegram or about on Belarus only. So it makes sense to bring these things somehow together and look from various points of view. And I would say that the main issue here would be finding ways of a decentral way of looking at this issue, because in the end of the day, one of the reasons why Telegram works so well in so many contexts is that it allows decentral organization from below.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. So we had some answers. Oh, I think someone needs to mute, and I mean, can I ask for help with that? So yes, we had some answers, and we also got a lot of questions, and still so many open-ended issues, which I think is good. Which there's still so much space, so many things to talk about, and talking about questions. So now I will leave my position, being the single one asking questions. So if there are any questions from our participants, from our audience, just please raise your hand. You can ask your questions. So is there anyone willing to say something, to ask a question? Okay, I'm sorry, I still think I can hear someone talking. Yeah, so if I can ask all the other participants who are not speaking right now to mute their mics, that would be really helpful. Thank you. And yeah, we have a question from Lida. So please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm calling from Chicago in the United States. And the question of comparing beyond Europe is fascinating and significant. From our perspective in the US, the situation with China and Russia, the situation with China and Taiwan, the situation in Hong Kong is very relevant to what's happening in Ukraine. So I'm very curious to hear from the panelists to what extent your own curiosity stretches to East Asia.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Maybe if there is one more question, then we can collect two of them or three, and then get back to our speakers. So, is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Okay, so if not, maybe in a second. So if I could ask Andrei, Natalia, Catherine, and Felix to answer Lida's question now.
Well, I could offer an answer there. I think that's a tremendously interesting question, Lida, and I would say in my own case, it certainly does. I think one thing which this war has demonstrated, as all wars prior to it have demonstrated, is just how interconnected or entangled, the word that has been used before in this session, we all are. I would only cite, for example, the kinds of alliances that Russia might be forging, not just, perhaps not with Western European countries, but or with North American countries, but in Asia, as you mentioned, but also in Africa, throughout Africa. And that reminds me, for example, this war, and given we all know Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse, but to see the extent to which it begins to affect food supplies around the world was really stunning to me, full while recognizing the import of Ukraine in terms of agricultural production. And that's just one way in which I think it's really important to situate any kind of issue in as broad a framework as one can, because you begin to see connections that you perhaps otherwise would have missed. So I think although I've been in other discussions where one completely dismisses Asia, I think that's problematic, because I think those connections, especially between Russia and a variety of Asian countries, have always historically been there, but they remain in place even today.
Thank you. And Andrei, go ahead.
The question is indeed very interesting, and I would say that the main emotion about China in our talks in Ukraine is rather fear than curiosity. Well, that's how I mean, that's a very subjective observation just from the talks I had in Kiev and Lviv during last month. And this is imagined as something that we do not know, and something that we don't know how to deal with. But another thing I would add here, it's interesting that you mentioned East Asia and not just China. There is something to that because, for instance, an imaginary about North Korea in Ukraine, I think, has transformed a little bit when North Korea suddenly started to manifest its political agency through supporting Russia on different votings. And the news circulating about North Korea assisting with the weapons or even with soldiers or with workers for constructions and occupied territories in Donbass, for instance. And then even more recently, there were new evidences about people from Central Asian states coming to construction sites in Mariupol, for instance, and other locations in Donetsk Oblast. So that direction, I don't want, again, to orientalize, because I mentioned Central Asia and then North Korea and China, which are all very different places. But I think this is something to think about. And maybe colleagues will just add something on imagining China, because I am very subjective telling this.
Okay. I might add not specifically about China or Asian context, but rather about positioning yourself in the wider network and how it somehow helps you to overcome both your own biases, but see some kind of a light in this very dark moment of time. Within our initiative, we had a set of international seminars with scholars who are working on violence and trauma in different contexts, both geographically and historically. And we had scholars who worked on Rwanda, South Sudan, Iran, in some of the favelas in Brasilia. So quite diverse context and different types of violence performed by different both state and non-state actors. And it helps you to see how scholars with different backgrounds deal with quite similar challenges that you might face while you document the war and live through it. But it also helps you to see the long-lasting effects of violence on the societies, but also that all wars and conflicts end at some point. And it gives us hope that this world will also end, and we will also deal with this post-war recovery of Ukraine, which will have its own challenges. But at the same time, all this comparison, meaningful one and well-informed one, really helped us during the spring and summer of 2022, when we really needed to see this wider perspective because all the world collapses into here and now.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Anyone else raising hand? You can also post a question in the chat. Okay, if not, then just let me say it. Oh yeah, Andrei, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about one more challenge we did not mention. I think this is a challenge of knowing how to put it. Well, I'm now speaking from Georgia. I was here on a conference about mobility studies, and I overheard conversations on the streets And that were conversations also of people from Mariupol, for instance, who came here to meet their children who live in EU, in the European Union. And I was thinking about that particular parts of Ukraine are now inaccessible to all of us. And it's a challenge of knowing about them, or we cannot pretend they do not exist, but they also remain completely understudied. Or also there might be like alternative knowledges proposed by researchers who have access there, or who dare to go there. Recently, there was a controversy connected to an urban researcher going to Mariupol from Krasnodar region of Russia, claiming he has good intentions and he does not support war, but he understands that it's important, that the recovery, post-war recovery of Mariupol is important. And a Ukrainian colleague of mine who lived and worked in Russia for the last 12 years, she tried to initiate the discussion among Russian scholars, like whether it is acceptable way to produce knowledge. And the argument that she has heard was, okay, if no one produces, then who will know about those territories? I don't have an answer about this, but yeah, Georgia is a place to think about it. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for this comment. Indeed, this is one area we did not discuss, but it doesn't mean we will not in the future. Just thinking of our next meetings and how we progress with our thinking about not only the project of the testimonies from the war, but the general field of study. So I think this is also very, very, very relevant. Felix.
I just wanted to, like, I was thinking apropos Taiwan, among those early refugees from Kharkiv, there were two students I met on my way to Germany. There were two students. One was a Turkish student in medicine, and the other one was a student from Taiwan doing his degree in architecture in Kharkiv, and it is obvious and totally natural that they did it in Russian, and that there were thousands of foreign students in Ukraine, not only in Kharkiv. And like now, after a year later, I just had a look on WhatsApp and asked how they are, and it turned out that the Turkish student ended up in a quite depressive trap, because in Germany he is being granted permission to stay only for 1 month, and he basically cannot really follow up with his studies in his Ukrainian university, because there are some practical parts of this medicine studies needed to be carried out at some point. And the Taiwanese student is finishing his architecture degree in Oldenburg. It's in northern Germany, and doing quite well, because he is able to do it in English, what is not a possibility to do an English diploma in Germany. But this is just it just came to my mind apropos Taiwan, and now I lost what I wanted to say. So.
Okay, so I will try to conclude very slowly. Felix, in case you get back to what you wanted to mention, then feel free to speak up. So, well, just to conclude, I mean, of course, it was my huge pleasure to talk with you today, to ask the questions and to learn so much. And I think the issue about how to produce and how to describe the war, I remember the analysis coming from the West, like how much the war will take. And it started from 2 days, 3 days, a week, and so on, and then it got lost. Hope we will not see this kind of analysis regarding the current conflict in many other research fields. And still there is so much to do. So thank you very much for talking today, for the seminar. Thank you everyone who came to listen to us this evening. And well, thank you so much, and have a nice evening, and hope to see you on our next meetings, next seminars, and in our research field as well, however it looks soon.
Sure. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure indeed.